All right, welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government, and I'm Ken Hicks. We've been talking about the Constitution. We're going to continue that discussion because, again, constitutional principles are extraordinarily consequential in a nation of laws. You have to be prepared to follow the rules. And one of the more important rules is this idea of federalism. This is one of the more original contributions to constitutional theory that Americans of that founding generation helped to create. It's a really kind of novel theory of sovereignty. And we're going to look at this idea of vertical checks and balances. And the two main topics that we're going to talk about today is this notion that federalism is established by the Constitution and that national and state powers have shifted over time. Now, it's important to keep in mind, federalism was not an entirely original idea, okay? Keep in mind that the founding fathers, the framers of our Constitution, were classically educated in England. They predominantly had sort of what we would think of as an English education. And their understanding of politics was informed by the struggles of England to hold Scotland and Wales and Ireland within the Union. And so they had some experiments with this idea of autonomy. They also had understanding of what was going on the continent itself. And of course, you had the German principalities of those days that were also kind of theorizing about different forms of government. This idea of sort of a greater Germany was alive, going all the way back to the time of Charlemagne. And so there were people who had thought about these ideas of compound sovereignty. But it's important to keep in mind that the Constitution and the idea of federalism is a product of a particular time and place. You had a group of people who were, of European tradition and religious, convictions that were kind of separated suddenly from Europe and European thought, and that kind of created this moment in time where people could think of government in a unique way. So federalism is, again, established by the Constitution, and it structures the relationship between and among the national and state governments and ultimately local governments as well. It's important to keep in mind, and we'll talk more about this later on. Local governments have no status within the Constitution. So it is predominantly, the idea of federalism is predominantly a relationship between a national government and between constituent state governments. And it is an idea that involves this notion of shared or negotiated sovereignty. Now, what is sovereignty? It's oftentimes a word that we use, but we don't always know what it means. And it, again, is a compound term that emerged in the early period of nation building in Europe. And it involved sort of the conflicts of that day between the church and between respective political units of the time. It's important to keep in mind the Catholic Church was the dominant unit, the dominant religious institution of Europe in that period. There had not been a Protestant Reformation, although the conflicts between an increasingly secularized church and the respective secular rulers of Europe ultimately would provoke the Protestant Reformation. Increasingly, what you began seeing was that the Catholic, the church leaders were trying to kind of put their thumb on the scale, to the advantage of one set of rulers over another. And that increasingly kind of led to this sense in which people below, even within the church, people like Marsilius of Padua, who was a major kind of church figure of the early modern period, wrote a long treatise basically saying the church needs to get out of secular affairs and allow secular rulers to govern the world as we know it, and the church should be worried more about spiritual matters. And so that increasingly led to this sense in which sovereignty is, again, a compound of a number of kind of Roman terms that reflects this idea of the majesty of rule, the sense in which, the authority of governing figures come from somewhere. And, during the feudal era, that somewhere was heaven, that God made people, God anointed people as rulers. This was the whole idea behind the divine right of kings. But ultimately also a rival idea becomes increasingly important, and that is the notion of popular sovereignty, and that is the sense in which the authority of governors emanates from the governed, that the people must consent to be governed. Okay, so the United States was not the first nation to adopt federalism. There were several factors that contributed to the likelihood of a nation adopting a federal system of government. Nations with diverse ethnic, language, or regional groupings are most likely to find a federal system of government more congenial than a unitary system where all authority is lodged in a national government. A good example is Switzerland, right, where you have a very mountainous geography, and it's combined with the fact that the Swiss population is divided almost evenly between German, French, and Italian-speaking peoples, right? In the Constitutional Convention, the last resort to federalism made sense because the basic division between those states were beginning to move in a capitalist Republican direction, those states in the North, and those states whose economies were dominated by slave economies in the South really were at loggerheads as to how they would be governed kind of collectively. We often reference the idea of the American experiment, and the experiment refers to the idea of democratic governance. However, in 1787, there wasn't much in the way of democracy included in the Constitution. There were some nods in that direction, and it could evolve in that direction. But fundamentally, federalism was a pragmatic way of combining two fundamentally distinct political communities, one moving in the direction of capitalism, the other moving resolutely towards the domestic manifestation of authoritarianism, replete with slave patrols, rigged elections, and rule by a planter elite. So you also have this traditional state and local bias of American federalism, particularly prior to the Civil War. A great deal of governance took place at the state and local levels. The practical effect of how federalism was practiced in those early years was that there was a considerable variation in both the policies and in the quality of governance from state to state, and even from county to county. The fact that the United States experienced its Industrial Revolution following the Civil War, fully kind of 90 years into the Constitution being in effect, fundamentally changed the nature of federalism as localism became more and more kind of problematical from an economic perspective. So as economic expansion combined with urbanization and technological changes increasingly required the federal government to take on greater levels of governing responsibilities, you began to see a steady encroachment on areas where state and local governments had already established a presence and often looked at intrusion by the federal government as unwelcome. Okay. So that relationship between and among the three levels of government is, sometimes it's collaborative and oftentimes it's conflictual, is what we call intergovernmental relations. So what are the political ramifications of federalism? First and foremost, you get lots and lots of policy variations at the local level that can oftentimes affect life choices. Both political parties invoke federalism strategically, tactically, if you will. For example, Republicans portray themselves as the party of small government, and defenders of federalism. But George W. Bush advanced several big government policies over the course of his 2 terms in office, including the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 and the USA Patriot Act of 2001, both of which expanded the size and power of the federal government. Likewise, as Democratic presidents, both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama took actions that run contrary to the perception that Democrats are the party of big government, issuing waivers to local schools and to county governments for federal laws that would otherwise have imposed onerous mandates. So federalism can both mobilize and demobilize American citizens. On the one hand, the multiple layers of government provide citizens with numerous opportunities to engage with government. On the other hand, the complicated and often overlapping policies at the federal, state, and local levels can be highly confusing to citizens, and often citizens express their frustration in identifying which level of government they should be addressing. And so oftentimes, recently you're seeing people running for office here in Oklahoma talking about the border. They're running for state government office, and yet they're talking about, closing the border. State governments don't have really a significant role to play in managing the border. That has historically been interpreted by the courts as an exclusively national issue, an issue for the federal government. Now, Texas and Arizona have at various times attempted to control the border of their states, the Mexico-Texas border and the Mexico-Arizona border. But when those instances, they have come into conflict with the federal government, like for example with Greg Abbott, wanting to set buoys across the Rio Grande River, and the federal government has opposed it. Federal courts have consistently held that under the Supremacy Clause, the federal government has exclusive control over immigration policy. Now, again, and what you would say as a judge is to people in Texas and Arizona, your remedy is to elect people to the federal government that will enact immigration policies that will help your state, rather than looking at the state as a vehicle for managing immigration policy. And again, the deadlock at the federal level. And this is important because, again, the Biden administration, and this is something, again, that reflects sort of it can make you cynical when you think too much about it. But the Biden administration and the Biden campaign recognized that immigration was an issue that was hurting his campaign reelection chances and was hurting Democrats in federal elections. And so they negotiated with Republicans, including Oklahoma's senior senator, James Lankford, on a very tough immigration bill. And ultimately what happened was, despite the fact that it got enough votes to pass through the Senate, even with a filibuster-proof majority, ultimately Donald Trump, the Republican presidential candidate, publicly declared that he didn't want that bill to pass. He wanted to be able to campaign on the issue. And, again, this is something where campaign year election issues get in the way of people doing what is the right thing, which is to say, we need immigration, but we need it to be legal. We need people to be coming into the nation in the light of day and not, in the darkness and hiding outside of the law. So we need to, reform our immigration system, particularly our refugee laws. And we need to have more people to adjudicate refugee claims. That's how you resolve the issues at the border. So what are some of the powers of the national government? Again, if you remember, expressed powers are those powers directly granted by the Constitution, either to Congress or to the President. Congress's authorization is in Article 1, Section 8, and the President's are found in Article 2. Implied powers are derived from Article 1, Section 8's necessary and proper clause. And we talked about this in one of our previous presentations, where Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress is empowered to do anything that is necessary and proper for continuing the powers that are clearly enumerated and expressed by the Constitution. And that we call that the elastic clause because it can dramatically expand the governing capacity of the federal government. And by extension, because most often when Congress is passing legislation, they are oftentimes delegating a task to the president. And so that necessary and proper clause is a big part of the reason why the size and the scope of the federal government dramatically increased over the course of the 20th century. Likewise, the Constitution's supremacy clause declares federal laws as the supreme law of the land. So in any instance where you see a state or local ordinance actually violates something that is clearly, a piece of federal legislation. For example, Missouri and I think a couple of other states passed state laws that made it illegal for state officials to cooperate with federal officials related to gun, issues. Well, guess what? That is plainly, the minute that passed the state legislature, it was unconstitutional because it places the federal agents and state agents in conflict with one another. And the federal law and the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. The state governments also have clearly, kind of articulated powers, or I might even say vaguely articulated powers. The 10th Amendment's reserved powers clause was included to reassure the concerns of anti-federalists that the states would be subsumed under a national government. It's important to keep in mind there are also concurrent powers that both state and national governments enjoy. Both state and national governments can create corporations. Both state and national governments have the power to tax, which is all important. You cannot have a government if you lack the authority to tax. There are some people who say that taxation is theft. That is frankly a radical and anarchistic claim. You cannot rely as a government solely on voluntary contributions from citizens. If you do not tax, you cannot govern, because governing inevitably involves elements of coercion. Okay? We don't obey speed laws because we think it's a good idea. We obey speed laws because you can get in trouble. You can get a ticket if you don't obey the speed laws. So it's important to keep in mind that government involves elements of coercion, and those most expressions of coercion are those kinds of things that are necessary for holding political communities together. It's also important to keep in mind that the states enjoy what are known as police powers, and that allow them to regulate the health, safety, and importantly, morals of their citizens. So that last phrase, the idea of regulating morality, is what we consider to be the idea of education. Okay, and so historically, education was predominantly something that was delegated to local governments. One of the first things you did when a state would say that this township is established, one of the first things that would happen is that they would build a school, they would build a courthouse, they would build churches. These were the institutions of local government. Okay, over time, the federal government has sought to constrain the state's police powers in instances where states have clearly demonstrated a determination to use their powers in a discriminatory manner against disfavored groups. On the West Coast, it was first the Chinese and then the Japanese. In the South, of course, it was blacks following the Civil War. In the Northeast, it was oftentimes immigrants. In every place in the United States, members of the LGBTQ plus community were subject to periodic harassment and sustained discrimination. And so we look at the 14th Amendment, and we should keep in mind the 14th Amendment was drafted by people who understood that discrimination was a basic problem and that it was not confined to former slaves. As drafted, the 14th Amendment basically empowers Congress to combat discrimination against all peoples. So when I say that the 14th Amendment is one of the most dramatic revisions of our federal Constitution, up there with the 16th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, I mean that it fundamentally alters the nature of the relationship between the federal government and the state governments, and also between the federal government and local governments. When you look at this slide, America side by side, it shows you which countries are federal and which countries are unitary. And as I asked the question, what explains why a country might use a federal or unitary system of government? And the main thing is typically the existence of significant sectional or cultural differences within the country. For example, Germany adopted a federal system of government because you have very different components of what we now consider to be Germany. You have Prussia, which was traditionally sort of the home of German culture, and then you have Silesia, Bavaria, Alsace-Lorraine. Those regions had been passed back and forth between Prussia and the Austria-Hungarian Empire over the course of centuries. And so, very different cultures emerged. And so Germany found it more congenial to have a sort of, a federal system of government. Likewise, if you look at India, part of the reason why federalism works in India is because of the caste system, but also because different regions of the country, for example, the eastern part of India has a very large Muslim population. There are Tamils dominating in the south. They have ethnic and religious differences and language differences that make federalism a better way of managing their politics. Okay. The states also owe to one another certain obligations. Article 4 includes the idea of the full faith and credit clause, which requires states to honor the public acts and judicial decisions of other states. I'll give you an example. I went to college initially in Georgia. When I applied for graduate school, I was accepted into the University of South Carolina. Well, in order to go to graduate school, you have to have a college degree first. If South Carolina refused to acknowledge my Bachelor of Science degree in political science, they wouldn't have been able to accept me into the graduate program in government and international relations at the University of South Carolina. Likewise, when I applied for jobs, I went to graduate school fully intending to work in higher education. I had applications as far south as southern Florida, as far north as Maine, as far west as coastal Washington and California and Texas. I had over 90 applications. Ultimately, I was interviewed and offered a job here at Rogers State University. This was the first full-time job I really held in higher education. Again, if Oklahoma had said, well, we're not going to accept doctoral degrees from South Carolina because that might place the doctoral graduates from the University of Oklahoma or Oklahoma State at some disadvantage. Well, I would have been out of luck, right? But because of the full faith and credit clause, I am allowed to come and teach here in Oklahoma. And again, think about the economic implications of this. This facilitates freedom of movement. That if you earn, if you become a lawyer or a medical doctor, You still have to go through a qualification process if you move from one state to another. As a lawyer, for example, you have to be admitted to a bar association. But if you've earned a Juris Doctorate, for example, if I'd gone to law school and earned a Juris Doctorate at the University of South Carolina's excellent law school, and decided I wanted to practice in Oklahoma, or if I skipped a point. If I had passed the bar in Oklahoma and then subsequently decided I wanted to move to Oklahoma, Oklahoma would generally not compel me to retake the bar exam because I am considered to be, but I would have to go through a process, right? I may not have to go through a full, bar exam type thing, but I would still have to be certified to practice law here in Oklahoma. So again, the professional title that you hold confers upon you a benefit that is portable. It means you can take it from one state to the next. And that requires, that's why that clause, full faith and credit, is important. States have faith in other states that what they are doing is legitimate and acceptable, right? That the degrees that are conferred. This is one of the reasons why so much of our conflict, the culture wars, is so troubling in many ways, because a lot of times the argument is, people that go into education have been, somehow indoctrinated into some neo-Marxist ideology. Well, in K through 12 education here in Oklahoma, an overwhelming percentage of the people who work and teach here are Oklahomans. They were born here, they were raised here. It's actually hard to get people to come from other states to teach in Oklahoma because comparatively, compared to Arkansas, compared to New Mexico, Colorado, Texas, Kansas, all those states pay better than Oklahoma. So it's remarkable to me that you're attacking these folks who almost universally have gotten their teaching certifications from Oklahoma schools, that they're somehow indoctrinated and are bent on indoctrinating other people. I simply don't believe there's any evidence to support that argument. So the history of interracial marriage likewise reflects, again, considerable leeway that states had in terms of the kinds of marriages they were obliged to respect. In the middle of the 20th century, 30 of the 48 states prohibited interracial marriage. Tolerance of interracial marriage was finally nationalized by the Supreme Court in 1967. I was 4 years old when that Supreme Court decision was handed down. So this is within our lifetime that interracial marriage was banned by states. And the case in that instance was Loving versus Virginia, and we'll talk more about that in a later presentation. Same-sex marriage was treated similarly, with 35 states passing what were known as Defense of Marriage laws, DOMA laws, in the 1990s as conflict over same-sex marriage heated up in state courts. The federal government passed the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, which Bill Clinton signed, but said it was one of the things that he regretted the most of his presidency. So in 1996, the DOMA law the federal DOMA law basically declared that states were not required to recognize other states' same-sex marriages. That law and similar state laws were finally struck down in 2015 with a landmark decision in Obergefell versus Hodges, which now again compels all states to offer same-sex marriage licenses and to respect other states' same-sex marriage contracts. This is something, when I was first teaching at the University of South Carolina, that law had just been passed, the DOMA law had just been passed, and I would ask my students if they believed it was constitutional. And I would show them the reasons why I believed it really did plainly violate the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution. There's also a clause in Article 4, Section 2, it's Privileges and Immunities Clause, that prohibits states from discriminating against other states' citizens or provide their own citizens with special privileges. This is something that came to light in Alaska, where Alaska basically had passed a statute saying that Alaska citizens had first claim to jobs within the oil and gas industry in Alaska. That law was challenged and struck down as, again, violating the Privileges and Immunities Clause. So you also have in that Article 4 the Comity Clause, and that also relates to criminal justice via the idea of rendition. And rendition means that if a person is believed to have committed a crime in one state and then flees to another state, that state has an obligation to apprehend that person and return them to the place where the crime was committed. So rendition is an argument, again, that the states have to return. And this actually included a clause, and we'll talk more about this when we get to our presentations on civil rights. That included in the original Constitution a rendition requirement for escaped slaves. This was the basis of the Fugitive Slave Act, which again became very controversial in the run-up to the Civil War. Local governments and the Constitution. As I mentioned earlier, local governments enjoy a peculiar, actually they don't enjoy a peculiar status in the American constitutional system because they have no status. They are not formally mentioned within the Constitution. That gives rise to what an Iowa State Supreme Court justice described as Dillon's rule. The judge was named Dillon, which basically said that local governments do not enjoy any kind of constitutional protection, meaning that states can do whatever they want to them. They can abolish them, they can regulate them, they can do anything to them. They do not enjoy any kind of legal protection. Now, many states have sought to ameliorate that lack of constitutional status by granting certain municipal areas what are known as home rule status. That gives to larger municipalities a certain amount of autonomy related to their ability to engage in self-governance. And you can imagine, that it's the larger cities in the United States, New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles. These are the municipal governments that are almost, states unto themselves. When you think about Los Angeles, for example, more people voted for Donald Trump in Los Angeles, just the city of Los Angeles, than voted for Donald Trump in the entire state of Oklahoma. Okay? That little nugget of trivia helps you understand the scope and the scale of American government. When a city like Los Angeles, which again, 60% of Los Angeles' residents voted for Joe Biden in 2020, but almost 40% voted for Donald Trump. And that 40% was larger than the entire turnout of the state of Oklahoma and many other states. So states like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, states just behind them like Phoenix and Houston, these are huge metropolitan areas that are enormously, heavily populated, and where, again, local governments play a very consequential role, not only in the governance of the counties wherein they reside, but also within the state, because they are a large proportion of that state's population. If you think about Illinois, Chicago, part of the reason why Illinois is so reliably Democratic is that Chicago dominates the remainder of the state. There are more people living in Chicago than live in the rest of Illinois. So how to make yourself heard at a local meeting, okay? Domingo Morel, who's a co-founder of the Rhode Island Latino Policy Institute and assistant professor at Rutgers University in Newark, basically put together some rules for how to go about approaching local government. Number one, you need to figure out which governmental entity has jurisdiction over the issue, and then you have to go to that level of government and try to get your issue placed on the agenda. Most school boards, city councils, or other government entities have an online sign-up so that you can go through the internet and figure out what you need to do to get your issue placed on the agenda. You should do your research on the issue, because very often local governments don't have the resources to adequately research issues related to local governments. And oftentimes they simply are, for example, with a municipal government, with the city council, they're oftentimes just listening to what's coming in front of them. And if it's a contractor, a builder, that's doing all the talking, they're just going to take their word for it. Okay, if citizens get involved and say, we really don't want this development to go forward, then the city council will take notice, because they recognize that if they've got 300 people sitting in front of them angry at a proposed building development, then that's something that can get them beat in a future election if they do the wrong thing. Prepare a statement. You're not going to have a lot of time, so be prepared. Rehearse your statement, time it out. Many times you'll only have about 2 minutes to talk to the city council or the school board or whatever. Number 4, you need to follow up. Email members of the board or the council. Broadcast your issue on social media. For example, there are lots and lots of local local social media groups that are very concerned with Oklahoma education and have been for quite some time, even before you ended up with the superintendent of public schools that appears to be very hostile to teachers. And so those groups got organized and they share a lot of information. Rule number 5, consider how collective action may be more powerful. A lot of times, if you bring a lot of people to a council meeting, and if they're sharing your concerns, for example, with this guy, he's a Latino, he represents a lot of Latino issues. When city council recognizes that a considerable portion of the Latino population of a town is galvanized about an issue, they're going to be more careful, and they're going to listen more carefully to what the alternatives are that are actually making people angry or concerned. Number 6, work across generations. See if there are other people within your community who worked on education at a different period of time. And number 7, work the federal system. If the local government is closed to what you want to do, go to the state level. If the state level is closed, work federally. That's, again, one of the beauties of federalism, is this idea that you can climb the ladder if you need to. And that's important to keep in mind. That citizenship, you don't just have to take your lumps and sit silently if you don't like an outcome at one level of government. So the second topic we're going to talk about today is the idea of national and state powers have shifted over time. And it's important to keep in mind. The framers, first and foremost, it's entirely likely that the framers of the Constitution, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, fundamentally had different ideas of what they were doing when they created federalism. The Southern delegates probably thought that they were securing for all time the status of slavery as a legal institution within what was becoming the United States. The delegates from the northern states possibly didn't agree with that, but weren't necessarily keen on disabusing Southern delegates of that idea. Okay? So federalism was not designed to be unchanging. The flexibility of a federal system of government was weaved into the fabric of the Constitution. It is a feature, not a bug. But it is also, I want to keep in mind, for those of you who are taking a class for credit, if you're taking an American government class, whether it's mine or someone else's, this chapter is one of the most difficult to understand because federalism changes over time. It mutates, okay? And that was considered to be a feature and not a bug of the system. And so over time, changing circumstances has resulted in a shift of power between the federal government and the state governments. When you think about it, one of the challenges today, part of the reason why you're seeing so many ads on television right now for state governments is that, a lot of conservatives want more government taking place at the state level. And so they began in, around 2010, really prioritizing state legislative elections. And so they actually started going on air with ads, pushing, a particularly conservative view. There's a new group now within the Oklahoma State Legislature, the Oklahoma Freedom Conference or something like that, where they're basically trying to target what they consider to be moderate Republicans and primary them and get them defeated because they don't think those folks are conservative enough for Oklahoma politics. And so, again, that reflects the intensifying competition at the local level, okay? So, the main way that we should understand federalism for a good portion of American history, well into the 20th century, was what we might call the traditional system of federalism, where the national government had relatively little kind of direct authority over the lives of citizens and over their ability to regulate state and local matters. So this was what we call dual federalism or layer cake federalism. The national government had certain narrow sets of concerns, and the state governments had a relatively narrow and discrete set of concerns, and they didn't really interact with one another. There were not zones of authority that would enable the federal government to regulate state actions. So the focus of the federal government in this period was on infrastructure. The federal government was using tariffs for most of their funds because they really weren't doing a whole lot. And so ultimately what was happening was you had the federal government building canals. One of the main reasons why Chicago became such a major city was because of the Erie Canal, which connected New York with Illinois. Okay, so that's brought the kind of the Great Lakes system into as a vehicle for transportation. Clearing waterways was another, like the Mississippi and the Illinois River and the Ohio River. Because at that time, of course, you didn't have railroads, and water transportation was one of the main ways that goods got from the coasts into the interior. Likewise, they spent a lot of time building lighthouses to help shipping get into harbors safely in that period. That was sort of the main thing that the federal government was doing in that period. And the state governments were pretty much doing everything else. But ironically, it's important to keep in mind that much of the government was happening at the local level from 1788 until really well into the 19th century. State governments were also committing a lot of effort to economic development, to building roads that could, for example, stone-paved roads that would not get washed out in the spring when you had rains, or would not become frozen in winter. So when you look at the traditional system, the national government was focused on internal improvements, subsidies. They tried to indirectly help, nudge the state governments in certain ways. Tariffs, which again were taxes on foreign goods that funded the government. Public land disposal. The federal government has always had the ability to basically seize public land and to use it for public purposes. You also had the issuance of patents And again, probably the most important thing they did was that they managed the currency, right? The value of the dollar was determined by the federal government and not by the respective state governments. The state governments were predominantly property, estate, and inheritance laws, commerce and banking, corporate occupations, and professions, again, deciding what the qualifications would be to be a lawyer or a doctor or a dentist. Family, morality, public health, and education laws, and again, it's establishing educational systems. Eminent domain, the use of, again, private property for public purposes. Various construction, land use, water, and mineral laws, and finally, management of local government. The state governments are responsible for establishing local governments, managing elections, and then, of course, establishing civil service laws. Again, most bureaucrats, most civil servants in the United States government for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, well, all of the 18th and much of the 19th centuries, were local employees. And then civil service. And then local government policies, adoption of state laws to local adaptation of state laws to local conditions. Public works, libraries, things like that. Water, fountains, contracts for public works, licensing for, public accommodations, zoning and other land use regulations, and basic public services. So again, if you want to build a house anywhere in the United States, you have to pay property taxes. First, you have to buy the property, and then you have to pay taxes because what's happening? Especially these days, you have to make sure that you're hooked up to water, or that you have septic. You have to, or a well. You have to make sure you have access to electricity. These are things that local governments do. Okay. So how did the Supreme Court respond to the demands for an increasingly large federal role? And again, we had this early nation-building phase of federalism jurisprudence. The first case that directly touched on federalism was the case McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. This was a case that dealt with the establishment of the National Bank of the United States, which was during the Washington administration. The Democratic Republicans did not like the national banking system because it competed with the state banks. And again, both national and state governments have the power to incorporate and to create banking entities. Now, why did the national government have a bank? This was the idea of Alexander Hamilton, that it actually predates the establishment of the central banking system that we have today. Alexander Hamilton understood that the federal government needed not only to manage the currency, but also needed to manage the availability of the currency, something that we nowadays call monetary policy. And he believed that the establishment of a federal banking system was essential to that operation. The states didn't like it, and the state of Maryland basically passed a law that would have destroyed the United States Bank in Maryland. William McCulloch was the manager of the bank. He protested, and ultimately the case ended up in litigation, where the Supreme Court held that the power to tax is the power to destroy, and state governments cannot destroy actions of the federal government. That your response is that you have to elect people that will reverse those policies, not go about destroying the federal policy in your state. That in fact, the establishment of the national banking system was constitutional under Article 1, Section 8, because it extended in a necessary and proper way the government's regulation of currency. Okay. Likewise, the case Gibbons versus Ogden. You had the regulation of the waterways of the river, I believe it's the James River between New York and New Jersey. New York had given to William Fulton a monopoly to manage traffic, water traffic on that river. And because James was the guy that invented the steam engine, and they wanted to benefit and to expand the use of steam power. New Jersey, didn't like that. So you ended up, in a case before the Supreme Court. The states wanted the federal government to adopt a very narrow interpretation of Congress's power to regulate commerce. The Supreme Court instead adopted a very expansive interpretation of that Commerce Clause. And they basically said, yes, the federal government has the power to regulate all interstate, trade. Okay. So again, Article 1, Section 8 in the Commerce Clause was interpreted in a very expansive way in order to, again, facilitate the movement of goods between states. So in that early period, the early part of the 19th century, the Supreme Court had a very broad interpretation of what Congress's and what the federal government's power to regulate state interactions was. However, in the post-Civil War period, the Supreme Court adopted increasingly constricted versions of the Commerce Clause or interpretations of the Commerce Clause, and held that various federal attempts to regulate commerce were unconstitutional. Among the areas the federal court attempted to regulate included business fraud, product quality, child labor, and a number of work-related issues like workplace safety, the hours that could legally be required to work, etc. Okay? Everything changed in the year 1937. For 70 years following the Civil War, American businesses were able to have their cake and eat it too. In other words, businesses enjoyed the benefits of national policies investing in commerce while being protected by the courts from federal policies protecting consumers and workers. In 1937, however, the Supreme Court issued a series of decisions that profoundly expanded the reach and scope of the Commerce Clause. In particular, the court upheld congressional acts protecting the rights of employees to organize and engage in collective bargaining. They also held that Congress could legislate on the amount of farmland that could be committed to cultivation, that they could extend low-interest credit to small businesses and farmers, and to restrict the activities of corporations dealing in the stock market. So 1937 was the year that, again, you saw, the expansion of the capacity of the federal government to regulate businesses and regulate the economy more broadly. So the New Deal, which really kind of begins with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932, fundamentally changes the relationship between the federal government and state governments and local governments. Okay? And again, the New Deal was a response to the catastrophic effects of the Great Depression at the state and local government. Remember, up until that time, state and local governments were primarily responsible for doing things like managing the economy at the local level. For example, if you were at a fishing village in New England, if a boat was destroyed in a bad storm, local governments would look after the widows and the orphaned children of those fishermen. The Great Depression was a disaster of a size and scope that simply was too great for state and local governments to respond to. It required a national response. The Great Depression began in 1929. By 1932, fully 1/4 of the workforce was unemployed and therefore not able to provide for their families. And I want to emphasize The statistics on the workforce did not include women. Women were not expected to work in that period. So it was even worse in many ways than our kind of contemporary understanding of things. We've never experienced that level of unemployment. So the incumbent president, Herbert Hoover, who was a Republican, adopted a hands-off approach to handling the Great Depression. He followed the advice of his Secretary of Treasury, basically saying, just allow the economy to liquidate and recirculate the malinvested money. That eventually the economy would right itself and we would be okay. But again, 3 years in, and you still had over a quarter of the population unemployed. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a Democrat, campaigned for the presidency on, again, a promise for a New Deal for the forgotten man. He actually, in some ways, ran to the right of Herbert Hoover, basically arguing that some of Hoover's halting attempts at fighting the Depression were actually, intrusions that hurt the economy. But once he won election, Roosevelt basically launched into action and fundamentally, again, changed the nature of the relationship, of basic federalism. Roosevelt proposed and Congress rapidly enacted a series of temporary relief and work programs financed by the federal government, but administered by the states. Roosevelt additionally presided over the creation of numerous important federal programs intended to provide future economic security for Americans, signaling again a much more activist national government and a much larger national government, frankly. So this gives rise to a period from the 1930s and sort of into the 1940s that we would describe as cooperative federalism. Remember, the first phase that goes really from the founding of the country into the 1930s, we would describe as dual federalism. Cooperative federalism involves the federal government dramatically expanding the use of categorical grants to the states to basically help the states do things that serve national purposes. So what were the two great events that were causing this massive increase of the energy of the national government? The first, as I mentioned a minute ago, was the Great Depression. But subsequently in 1941, you get the United States entrance into World War II. And in fact, 2 or 3 years before World War II, the federal, Franklin Roosevelt and other kind of political leaders recognized that the United States, that World War II is not going to stay away from us, that sooner or later we're going to be drawn into the war. And if we weren't prepared, the war could turn out badly for us. So increasingly, you're seeing the federal government moving towards an activist government through the use of grants and aid and categorical grants. Now, grants and aids were programs through which Congress provides money to state and local governments on the conditions that the funds be employed for the purposes defined by the federal government. For example, I went to a high school in Columbus, Georgia, that was basically the result of a grant and aid. The federal government gave to the state of Georgia grants to build high schools, okay, to build to build public institutions of education, okay. Categorical grants are congressional grants given to states and local governments on the conditions that expenditures be limited to a problem or to a specific group, again specified by law. Oftentimes these would be for building roads. It's certainly even prior to the Great Depression, a lot of money was being spent on grants by the federal government, a significant amount of money, not the amount of money that they were about to start spending. For building roads, because again, by, the 1910s, you begin to see more and more people driving cars. So cooperative federalism involved the federal government using federal funds to kind of nudge states, to encourage state and local governments to pursue nationally defined goals. That relationship, why do we call it cooperative federalism? Because during this period, the goals were predominantly things that state and local governments were perfectly happy to do, right? It's massive economic stimulus. The one thing that was not addressed was anything related to civil rights. Because Franklin Delano Roosevelt, remember, he won 4 presidential elections, spent 14 years as president. He had to win elections, and he could not afford to alienate Southern Democrats. And we'll talk more about this again when we get to later presentations. But for now, it's important to keep in mind that in the 1930s, the South was solidly Democratic territory. It's not until the late 40s into the 1960s that the South, that the Southern states, the states of the former Confederacy, the states that attempted to secede from the Union, that those states actually flipped from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. So cooperative federalism worked so long as controversial issues were left unaddressed. And the 2 categories of issues that would make federalism an increasingly contentious issue were civil rights and environmental regulation. These 2 issues would lead again to a major electoral realignment as Southern Democrats defected from the Democratic to the Republican Party, giving Republicans a durable electoral advantage from the 1980s to around the turn of the 21st century. So cooperative federalism is sort of a brief period in time, right? Because by the time you get to the 1950s, civil rights are beginning to become an issue that really can't be ignored, and in fact that the Democratic Party increasingly embraces, largely because of the large migration of blacks out of the South and into northeastern and midwestern and western cities. So the first time you actually see the Democratic Party have a significant debate over the issue of really any issue revolving around the Democratic platform is in 1948 when a young mayor of Minneapolis, Hubert Humphrey, delivers a speech calling for the insertion of a civil rights plank into the Democratic national platform. That profoundly offended Southern delegates. Many of them stormed out of the convention as a result. Okay, so what's emerging in replacing kind of cooperative federalism is what we might call regulated federalism, where national standards are beginning to be imposed, oftentimes in kind of confrontational ways, on the states. This is a form of federalism in which Congress imposes legislation on state and local government in the pursuit of national standards. And so you have basically what emerges as the bipartisan politics of preemption. As it relates to federalism, preemption refers to the principle that allows the national government to override state or local action in certain policy areas. Democrats have historically used preemption to impose tougher environmental standards, workplace safety standards, and expanded access to public spaces for disabled people, and the elimination of discrimination. When Republicans have enjoyed control of the federal government, they have used preemption to limit the ability of state and local governments to tax and regulate industry, or for local governments or states to regulate access to handguns. Okay? Likewise, the Trump administration's preemption of states' stringent vehicle emission standards is another example of Republicans using the federal government to impose on states. The Trump administration sought to compel states like California to loosen their vehicle emission standards in response to demands from the auto industry. Well, keep in mind, California has strict regulatory emissions policies for a reason. because of all the cars in their urban areas, and because, what's the old song from the 80s, no one drives in LA, and because of the geography. Remember, you've got mountains to the east of, in eastern California, and you've got the ocean that, pushes things in. You had this phenomena, this ecological phenomenon called smog, where pollution just hung over coastal cities. And so California has strict emission standards because, pollution was profoundly affecting the health of younger people. There were a larger percentage of young people in large urban California areas that were developing asthma as a result of smog. And so, because Republicans are anti-regulatory, that's part of the reason why California is dominated by Democrats, because in large part, what is a national Republican ideological preoccupation is something that happens to be profoundly bad for Californians and ultimately for Oregonians and Washingtonians as well. Coastal areas of those states, which are the most populated areas of those states, tend to be very environmentally conscious for a reason. They're in environmentally vulnerable areas. So to illustrate dual versus cooperative federalism, right? In layer cake or dual federalism, the responsibility of the national government and the state governments are clearly separated. However, in marble cake or cooperative federalism, national policies and state policies and local policies oftentimes overlap. And what you begin to see is this intermingling of money, where the money that's ultimately paying for something at one level of government is actually originating at a higher level of government. And this actually happens from the state from the federal to the state government level, and also from the state to the local level. This also gives rise again to what we would ultimately begin calling regulated federalism, where oftentimes the money that's coming from the higher level of government begins to have strings attached, and the higher level government is beginning to impose on that local level of government. This is what we might also describe as crammed down federalism, where there are more coercive elements being placed and conditions being placed on money that lower levels of government are increasingly dependent upon. So this slide shows you the rise in the use of federal grants and aid from 1960 to 2021. And keep in mind, again, even in 1960, there was a large grant, reality in place, okay? But today, look at it. I mean, we're talking about tons and tons. This is in millions of dollars, I believe. And so you're seeing an enormous increase. Federal spending on grants to state and local governments has grown dramatically since 1980s, okay? And today, state and local governments are increasingly dependent on those grants to implement their policy goals. And not being able to implement those policy goals oftentimes results in state and local officials paying a price, okay? So when you think about this, again, you're looking at a basic governance problem, right? This is one of the things that in the 1950s, there was a commission done on federalism, and one of the commission, I can't remember the name of the commission, but one of the commissioners said that it can all be broken down to this one little syllogism: too many governments, not enough government. And again, one of the things that you see within American federalism is you have one national government, you have 50 state governments, and then you have over 90,000 local governments. And that proliferation of local governments is oftentimes illustrative of the fact that local government is chronically starved for basic funds to do things that citizens expect, right? You see all the time that, for example, outside of Owasso, they're trying to create a special district. Why? Well, so they can raise revenues to adequately increase the level of services that a growing town like Owasso want. So let's talk about some Q&As to end this class. What was the original intent of the framers of the Constitution regarding federalism? Is there anything in the record of the Constitutional Convention as to how federalism should be interpreted? The answer to that question is there is very little. There were not a lot of notes taken. There was actually a secretary that was responsible for taking notes at the Constitutional Convention. Regrettably, that person was a chronic alcoholic, and so he didn't take very good notes. James Madison did take extensive notes, but there's little in the record that suggests that the framers spent a lot of time talking about federalism and how it would work. Okay? And so, like I said earlier in the presentation, it is entirely likely that some people had one understanding of federalism, and other people had a very different understanding of federalism. And ultimately, there was a constitutional scholar by the name of James Corwin, his last name was Corwin, I'm not sure if it was James, basically saying that a lot of stuff didn't get resolved at the Constitutional Convention, and that what was established was an invitation to struggle. An invitation for the politics of each exigent moment to work out how federalism would work. And so again, for all of the 18th and much of the 19th century, the big federalism issue really was slavery. And so ultimately, it took a war to resolve the issue of how we were going to manage the issue of federalism. Here's another one. It kind of sounds like the main reason for federalism was to protect slavery. Is that true? If so, why did federalism survive to the end of slavery? To some extent, yes. Federalism was initially a kind of pragmatic tool to manage the fundamental differences between the northern states and the southern states, and also between the larger states and the smaller states. Federalism survived because it remained a fundamental principle of government. It was clearly articulated or clearly implied within the Constitution. And nothing in the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendments or the subsequent amendments eliminate the idea that state governments enjoy sovereignty in certain areas. And so, absent a constitutional amendment, federalism continued on. Now, again, state governments have had, at various times, had relatively better or worse records in terms of their ability to actually govern. For much of the middle of the 19th century, past the Civil War and into the turn of the 20th century, state governments were profoundly corrupt and profoundly ineffective. That gave rise to the progressive movement, which was, we jokingly call it a GUGU movement, a good government movement that was designed to improve governance within the United States. And so part of the reason why it persisted was that Americans continue to believe in the states. For much of the, well into the 19th century, many Americans didn't consider themselves to be Americans. They considered themselves to be Virginians. They considered themselves to be New Yorkers. That really didn't begin to change until the post-Civil War era, when a lot of, the songs and the culture began to emerge, kind of extolling the virtues of this common Americanness that we talk about. I think I'm going to close on this note, and so when we continue, we will resume our discussion of federalism. I'll see you next time.